Hello, Francisco Gil-White. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming on. I've been getting so many requests to speak to you, to hear what you have to say. And well, I know some of your takes. I didn't dive too deep into them because I wanted to hear them here for myself. But I'm hearing that you have some, let's say, curious takes about world geopolitics, the Middle East in particular, what's happening in the United States. And, so why don't I just let you, well, you named your platform the management of reality.
hmm
So walk us through.
Well, thank you for having me on, Doran. Yeah, I call my effort the management of reality because I'm trying to develop a science for helping us to understand how the people who control the meaning-making structures, the reality managing structures, build a world for us to inhabit. And how can we tease apart what in the representation of reality that we are receiving might be true and what might be false, misleading, or manipulative. So this is basically what I'm doing. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're claiming that the main representation of reality that people are consuming through the most, authoritative institutions is largely false, if that's what you're saying, then of course your model of the world is going to seem curious to most people. And one of the main things that makes my model curious in the perception of most people is that there has been a tendency for people to get educated by the system into thinking that the way to build a model of geopolitics is to take at face value the representations of self that the different major actors on the geopolitical chessboard are making about themselves, right? So if Trump says that he's an enemy of the Iranians, then people are like, okay, so Trump is an enemy of the Iranians. If Trump says that he's an ally of Israel, people are like, okay, so Trump is an ally of Israel. And we say, no. What people say about themselves when they say that they're good or that they're your ally or that they're somebody else's enemy or whatever, none of that, in fact, carries any information useful to a scientific model of geopolitics. All of that is noise. It carries no signal value because making claims about yourself and about what you supposedly believe and what your intentions supposedly are and what you're allegedly planning to do, etc., all of that is free. It doesn't cost anybody anything to say, I am good or I am your friend. Nothing. The cost is zero. Therefore, if you're saying it honestly, or if you're saying it falsely, there's no way to distinguish it just from listening to you. And since the cost is zero, that means that the people who want to manipulate you will, of course, represent themselves in such a way as to make themselves acceptable to you. So we cannot build a model of geopolitics on the basis of what the major players say about themselves. We can only build a scientific model of geopolitics on the basis of what the major actors do. And we have to pay special attention to their costly behaviors, because when they pay, especially when they pay relatively big costs in order to get something done, that's when they reveal their true preferences, their true values, their true intentions, goals, and plans.
So I'll try to rephrase what I've heard in a very simple way so that you can say if I understood it correctly.
Sure.
Basically, you're saying that there is the management of reality, the name that you took to yourself in a sense, is the way that the state actors, the superpowers, let's say, they manage the perceived reality of other people, of me, for example.
That's correct.
Okay, and so that's like a bit of a conspiratorial thinking, right? So I guess
no. It's not a bit of conspiratorial thinking. It's an entirely conspiratorial mode of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I believe that if you're not doing conspiracy theory, you're just not doing political science, or geopolitics, because obviously the people in power have always conspired in order to achieve their special goals. And therefore, if you rule conspiracy theory out from your menu of possible theories that you can put on the table, all you're doing is you're giving the people who run the world the opportunity to do all kinds of conspiracies without ever getting caught, because you've already decided that you're not going to consider those kinds of hypotheses. Why would you ever give them that advantage? No, you have to always put the conspiracy theory on the table and discard it only if the evidence doesn't support it. There should be no principle against conspiracy theory. And the fact that there is a principle against conspiracy theory, and the fact that the universities all over the West teach us not to do conspiracy theory, and they teach us and they socialize us to feel ashamed if we ever come up with a conspiracy theory for which we will be immediately punished, right? So people will make fun of you, or you will lose your job, or you can't finish your PhD if you're doing conspiracy theory. All of this is diagnostic, in my view, of the fact that the schooling system has been captured by the people who don't want us to think about what's really going on.
And so, if that's the case, wouldn't the rise of social media weaken the supposedly conspiratorial structures?
Well, I think it has done that. So I think that ever since social media became a widespread phenomenon, in ordinary citizens like myself have had the opportunity to open up their own broadcast channels. And in principle, now any one of us can communicate with the entire world, in principle, right? Ever since this has been happening, certainly the threshold against, let us say, the grammatical barrier against doing conspiracy theory has definitely been weakened. And there is now much more social permission for doing conspiracy theory than we had before. That certainly did happen.
Okay, so how is your hypothesized conspiracy? How does that meet us in the real world? Let's say, like,
Okay,
give me examples.
Sure. So in the real world, I consider certain documented historical facts as being especially important, as having, let us say, special diagnostic value for building scientific models of geopolitics. For example, and most of these facts that I'm going to mention, or maybe all of them, are facts that most people don't know anything about. They're perfectly public, very well documented, but they are not part of a standard education, either in secondary school or university training. Okay, students just never see this, but that doesn't mean it's poorly documented. It's everything I'm going to say is perfectly well documented. So, for example, in 1988, historian Christopher Simpson documented with material obtained thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, which is the U.S. transparency law, that the entire intelligence system of the United States, what we call the CIA, was created by absorbing Adolf Hitler's intelligence system, Fremde Heer Oost. So the story is that Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's general in charge of Fremde Heer Oost, Fremde Heer Oost was the intelligence system of the German Nazis in Eastern Europe, for the Foreign Armies East, where the worst stuff of the war happened. And this Reinhard Gehlen was in custody. The head of all this was in U.S. custody at the end of the war. And he told his U.S. captors, he said, look, if you guys want, I have all the information hidden on the entire network. I know where all the spies are. I know their names. I can reactivate them. If you want, I can set this up for you. And they said, sure. And so the U.S. absorbed in secret at least tens of thousands of German Nazi spies and Nazi collaborators, including many, many officers of the SS, And with that created the CIA. And I can put Christopher Simpson's book on the screen if you want. I can share my screen and put it on the screen if people want to see it. But the point is that nobody disputes Christopher Simpson's research. In fact, after Christopher Simpson's research became public, historians that came after him, thanks to the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which is a later law that forced the release of a bunch of other documents having to do with the Nazis that were in U.S. archives. Once all of that was declassified, these later historians have been expanding on Christopher Simpson's work. And in fact, the number of Nazis who were absorbed to create the U.S. intelligence system keeps growing and growing the more people do research on this. So now it's interesting, however, that even though nobody disputes this, it never became a scandal. And I think that's diagnostic too. So the Washington Post and the New York Times both reported on Christopher Simpson's research. They accept it as true, but they never put it on the front page. They buried it in the back pages in tiny little book reviews that nobody saw. And the story never made it to the front pages. So over 99.9% of all US citizens don't know that the intelligence service of their country was created by absorbing Adolf Hitler's intelligence service. But that's not the end of the story. In 1956, and this is also perfectly public, Reinhard Gehlen, the guy who did all this for the US, whose headquarters was in Pullack, which is a suburb of Munich. In 1956, the U.S. government told the West German government, all right, the Germany that was in the free world, right, the one that was outside the Iron Curtain, or the U.S. ally, all right, the U.S. government told the West German government, the government of Konrad Adenauer, that they had to absorb what was called the Gehlen Org, which was Reinhard Gehlen's group in Pullack, as the BND. So that day in 1956, Reinhard Gehlen became the head of West Germany's intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND. It's West Germany's equivalent and now Germany's equivalent of the CIA. So the U.S. government absorbed the Nazis to create its own intelligence service, and then it returned the Nazis to power in Germany. That's what they did. This is diagnostic. They're Nazis. So you don't do this unless you're already a Nazi.
So I want to suggest another interpretation, right? I don't know. Well, of course, I'm going to take you at your word that all this is true. Okay.
Sure. For the sake of argument.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see any reason to doubt it, but I can look look this up.
You should definitely doubt it. You should definitely doubt it, and you should go check it.
Yeah, I will. But here's the thing. So you could take this in two ways. One way is to say, okay, so the person who was thought to have the highest, let's say, professional knowledge in how to start effective intelligence agencies, he was the one who was commissioned to do that for the US, right? And he brought his friends who he thought were also proficient. And then because he was so successful in the US, he was also asked to do the same in Germany, right? So that's one way to look at it, that this is a question of proficiency.
Let me try to paraphrase
1 second.
What you're saying.
I want to also present the alternative, and then you can.
Okay,
the alternative explanation, of course, you can also pick somewhere in between, but the alternative explanation would be that he started some sort of an ideological mafia, and he brought all his Nazi friends who are open, like, I don't know, not openly Nazi, right, but ideologically Nazis. And then using this sort of mafia, he also created the German intelligence agency. And so both of these agencies are steeped in, let's say, Nazi ideas and Nazi culture, right? This is the alternative explanation. One is purely proficient, the other is purely ideological, and there's also the whole range in between, right? So what do you make of this, and which interpretation do you lean towards?
Okay, so I think I need to first try to paraphrase what you said because I'm not sure that I understood it. So let me try that. I think you're saying that one interpretation of why Hitler used Reinhard Gehlen is that he was very professional at his job, not that he was a horrible Nazi, and that's also the same reason that the U.S. and then Germany used Reinhard Gehlen, because he was really good as a spy, and not because he had, not because he was particularly consumed by Nazi ideology. Whereas then there's another hypothesis that says, no, this is a real Nazi ideologue, and that's why Hitler and then the U.S. and then Germany wanted him.
Yeah, but you could also say that, yeah, he is a real Nazi, but that's consequential. Like the U.S. only cared about the professional stuff, and so did the West Germans, right? Something like that. Yeah, he was a Nazi, but now we don't really care anymore. It's like let's say that tomorrow, let's assume that Lebanon wants to create its own intelligence agency, and they take the head of the Mossad. Now, for them, for the narrative and the population, the head of the Mossad is the worst Zionist pig in the universe, right? But he's good at intelligence, so let's bring him over.
Well, actually, I think that's an excellent thought experiment to guide our reasoning. So, if Lebanon wanted to create an intelligence service, I claim that they would never hire the head of the Mossad because they would feel like they can never trust the head of the Mossad. So the question really for us is, why did the people running the United States think that they could trust the guy who had been running the spy agency for Adolf Hitler? That's the question. This is what you must answer. And it seems to me that there's no model that can explain why they trusted this guy, unless you say they are imbeciles. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they are Nazis. If they are Nazis, it makes sense that they trust a fellow Nazi. If they're not Nazis, then they would have to be imbeciles. Now, I don't like hypotheses that require you to say that the most powerful people in history are much stupider than me. I don't like hypotheses like that because they're way more powerful than me. So it seems more reasonable to me to say that people who are way, way more powerful than me have better information and are much smarter than me. I think that makes more sense. So I prefer hypotheses that don't make me say the most powerful people in the world are, mentally retarded. So I think I go with the other hypothesis. So why did they trust the Nazis to build their own intelligence service? Because they were already Nazis. And if you go back to the period of the whole first half of the 20th century, and you study that period in American politics, in American society, you find that the most important social movement of that whole first half of the 20th century in the United States was the most important social movement was eugenics. And eugenics was being led by the greatest fortunes in the United States, people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, Thomas Watson from IBM, the Harriman fortune, the railroad Harriman fortune, etc. They were all pushing millions of dollars into eugenics. And guess what? Eugenics is the ideology that produced German Nazism. And Rockefeller is the guy who put Roosevelt in the White House, right? So everything that the German Nazis did, they were learning it from the American eugenicists. The American eugenicists had tremendous victories in the United States, including legal victories. They made eugenics legal all over the United States with a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell. You can go look it up, which made forced sterilization and incarceration of people deemed to have low IQ, which was synonymous with not enough Germanic blood for these ideologues, all over the United States. This became legal. according to the research done by Edwin Black, who is the greatest historian of eugenics, hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens were either forcibly sterilized, incarcerated, or unmarried by state officials in the first half of the 20th century. Hundreds of thousands. And the German Nazis, when they began passing their Nuremberg laws in 1935, when they began instituting their policies, they were copying legal precedents that had been established in the United States, and they were doing most of what they were doing with a lot of U.S. funding from the same eugenicist monopolists in the United States.
So do you believe that these that today's, let's say, United States elites are the ideological inheritors of these Nazis?
Well, I'll answer your question, but I'll do it in a roundabout way, because there's an intuition, intuition lurking in your question, because people always ask me this, and I need to address the intuition first. The intuition people have is that the ideology of an institution is bound to change if you wait long enough. So if you tell people, oh, this institution was Nazi back in 1945, and you still have this institution today, people say, well, but it must have changed, because, half a century went by. They can't possibly still have the same ideology. This is the wrong intuition. This is not how ideological institutions behave. So imagine that you created with 9 other people the executive committee for an organization that will promote vegetarianism. So naturally, all 10 of you are vegetarians. You're interested in people not eating meat. So you might hire some mercenaries, for the marketing or whatever, but the people who run the organization, they have to be obviously vegetarians. So what happens after some years when one of the 10 people in the executive committee either retires or dies or whatever? You have a vacancy. Who's going to fill that vacancy? Who are the 9 remaining members on the executive committee of this organization to promote vegetarianism gonna hire to fill the vacancy? Well, they're going to hire another vegetarian, obviously. So the passage of time is not going to turn an organization to promote vegetarianism into a meat-eating organization, or an organization to promote meat eating, even if 50 years go by. Because every time there's a vacancy, they will recruit someone like themselves to fill the vacancy.
I would like to challenge your analogy.
Let me just draw the punchline, because this point applies even more strongly when you're talking about a very strongly felt political ideology like Nazism. An organization created by Nazis is not going to be hiring anti-Nazis to fill the vacancies. That's very dangerous for them. What they'll do is they'll make sure that whoever they recruit shares their ideology. And if they're not quite there, they will do whatever they need to do to bring them to that point. Because otherwise it's very dangerous to them, especially if they're acting in a universe where they're supposed to be they're not supposed to be Nazis. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, actually, I'll first challenge the analogy, and then I'll ask the question.
Sure.
So why I think the analogy is imperfect is because it's different to have a world vegetarian organization and call it a vegetarian organization, and to have, let's say, a health organization or a general nutritionist organization and fill it with vegetarians and make sure that it's always filled with vegetarians, right? These are not exactly the same cases. Like the name and my
only point is that if you create an organization with the purpose of furthering some goal that is an ideological goal, then it makes sense that whenever there's a vacancy, you will recruit someone with the same ideology. That just makes sense. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying it is impossible for an institution to transform itself. I would never say that. What I'm saying is that the expectation that the passage of time will naturally change the ideology of an organization is nonsense. You should expect the ideology of an institution to be relatively stable. You shouldn't expect the passage of time all by itself to transform the ideology of an organization.
What do you think the goals are today, right? Because Nazi Germany is gone. And so when you say they are Nazis, what do you mean? Like, what do they want in your estimation?
When I say that they are Nazis, I mean quite literally that they are Nazis. So the intelligence service of the United States was created absorbing bona fide, actual card-carrying German Nazis. That's what they were. They were members of Fremde Heer Oost and officers of the SS. That's who they are. So what do you think they started doing, these Nazis, who had just completed the genocidal destruction of the European Jews, right? So they had just finished doing that. And 2 years later, in 1947, they were already being absorbed as the new intelligence service of the United States. Now they have access to the treasury of the United States, which is the greatest concentration of money in all of history. And they can spend that money in secret without telling anyone what they did, because that's what the national security law of 1947 allows explicitly, right? So they don't have to ask anyone before they initiate an action, and they don't have to report that action if they don't want. They can just keep it secret forever. Okay, so with that kind of power, what wouldn't they do? It seems to me that since they're Nazis, the first thing they would do is begin spending money in secret to prepare the next great mass killing of Jews. Why? Because they're Nazis. That's what Nazis do. We saw them in World War II do everything possible to kill the European Jews. In fact, it is documented that when Germany was already losing the war, key resources were diverted from the collapsing German front to the death camps so that the killing of Jews could be accelerated before Germany ended up losing the war. So the killing of Jews is a primary objective for this ideological group. If you give them the access to the US Treasury and you write in the law that they can now spend that money in secret, the budget of the CIA is a state secret, well, then for all practical purposes, it's an infinite budget that these people can start spending in secret to prepare the next great mass killing of Jews.
And how do you go about doing that?
Oh, the first thing you do is you create something called the Oslo peace process. That's what you do, because the Oslo peace process, which the CIA did invent, the Oslo peace process came out of a document created by this guy, Graham Fuller, who was a CIA analyst, and it was published by RAND, which is a Pentagon think tank. And the entire strategy of the Oslo process is outlined there. It's a 1989 document, and I can send it to you. I have it. The entire diplomatic structure of the peace process was created and protected by the U.S. president. So it makes perfect sense that that's what Nazis would do, because the thing that the peace process achieved was to introduce into the Jewish state a terrorist organization that means to exterminate the Israeli Jews. And what they gave them inside the Jewish state is militarily strategic territory, the high ground, trapping the Jews between the hills of Judea and Samaria and the sea, and giving Egypt, another genocidal enemy, a strategic inlet into Israeli territory. So, of course, if you want to destroy the Israeli Jews in genocide, what you do is you invent the Oslo so-called peace process.
Right, and you said that the president is also somehow involved. So explain, because how does that move from the?
If you create, no, I think the way to reason about this is if you create an intelligence service that can spend the money of the citizens in secret, the president ceases to be relevant. From that point forward, the intelligence services will choose the president. And if the president seems to want to do something that the intelligence services disagree with, They will either scare that president, blackmail that president, or if necessary, kill that president. Right? It is relatively well known among us conspiracy theorists that John F. Kennedy was reported to have said that he was going to break the CIA shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. This was reported in the New York Times. 6 months later, he was dead.
Okay. So you believe essentially that the United States is an enemy of Israel, practically
Absolutely.
speaking.
That's exactly what I believe.
And you're an American, right?
I am a U.S. citizen and I am a Mexican citizen.
Yeah, and you're not a Jew.
No, I am not.
So that would make a lot of people think to themselves, well, why would you say that? Because most conspiracy theorists, they would say that somehow the powerful Jews or the Mossad, right, or any Israeli forces would be the one pulling the strings. And you're doing a 180 and you're saying, well, there is a conspiracy, but it's not the Jews, it's the Nazis. So,
right. So doing conspiracy theory is an area of theory. It doesn't, the fact that someone is doing conspiracy theory does not commit them to any one particular theory. So if you suspect that dirty stuff is going on in secret, that doesn't mean it has to be the Jews or it has to be the Germans or it has to be the Russians. You should let the evidence guide the construction of your model, right? So let us say the prelude to World War II, there was a vast propaganda effort to convince Westerners that the Jews were a secret conspiracy that clandestinely held the reins of every major institution in Western civilization, and that they were going to use their clandestine power to destroy Christian civilization. This propaganda effort had at its center a text that bears the title, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And that is a fraud that was produced by the Russian secret police. It was a conspiracy of the Russian secret police meant to convince Russians that their enemy was not the Tsar, but the Jews. And it was used to manipulate Russians into great mass killings of Jews in the second half of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century. So that's where this idea that the Jews are this great clandestine political conspiracy, that's where it came from. But we have the decisive refutation of this accusation. It is called the Shoah. If the Jews had really been clandestinely in control of every major institution in the West, then the Holocaust or the Shoah should have been very difficult, if at all possible. We should have seen tremendous resistance all over the institutional space of Western civilization to the effort to assassinate the Jewish people. But we saw the precise opposite. We saw all of the institutions of the West either eagerly helping or pretending to be revolted by what was going on, but doing nothing. This was the institutional behavior of the West. Nobody defended the Jews. Okay, not one country protected their Jewish populations effectively. So, and in fact, the argument that they collaborated with the Nazis in the killing of the Jews is very strong for most of the countries of Europe. So the accusation that the Jews were secretly in control, as the propaganda said, of the media, of the banks, of the workers' movements, the capitalist industries, the governments of the West, in particular the government of the United States, etc. It's all nonsense. The U.S. government didn't even receive Jewish the people running away from Hitler as refugees. So, they wouldn't even do that.
So your retort is to say that the difference is that my conspiracy theory is grounded on truth and the other one is not, essentially.
Well,
it's a fair thing to say.
Of course, my claim is that the theory I defend is supported by the historical facts. Of course, And that doesn't mean I'm right, but that is, of course, my position. And so the way to argue this is to see whether the model I'm defending actually explains what's going on. So to give you an example, in the last few days, just as one example of stuff that is perfectly consistent with my model, in the last few days, we saw the Iranian people rise up to try to throw from power the Ayatollahs who have been oppressing them for decades. And initially, Donald Trump, he paraded himself with his swashbuckling persona, making threats against the Ayatollahs that if they dared fire on protesters, he was going to get involved and there was going to be hell to pay and blah, blah, blah. That sounds good. It makes people think, oh, Donald Trump is anti-jihadi. Why? Because he says so. Look, he's screaming on the microphone. He's tapping with violence the keyboard on his Truth, to post messages on his Truth Social network. The man is almost losing control. He hates the Ayatollah so much. That's the impression you get from his speech. But then what happened? He would have been forced to act if he had continued in that vein. So that a couple of days later, he said, "Oh, well, I no longer need to do anything because they told me that they're no longer going to be killing people. They're canceling the executions." Well, this is really remarkable behavior. Well, if you're the enemy of the Ayatollahs and you want to get rid of them, they just gave you a golden opportunity, a golden grammatical opportunity. It's the same grammar that the U.S. employed in Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, the U.S. government claimed falsely that the Serbs were committing genocide against the Bosnian Muslims, right? They claimed that there was this humanitarian alleged catastrophe, and that was their excuse to start bombing the Serbs to produce regime change in Yugoslavia. So, come on, this is a golden excuse. If Trump had wanted to use it, he could have. Look, he used basically zero excuse in Venezuela, right? He just went and grabbed the head of state of Venezuela with zero basis in international law and the thinnest of excuses, which is that a U.S. court had declared the guy a criminal, which may be true, but from the point of view of international law, this is it's nothing. The UN Charter doesn't support this. So if he can do that in Venezuela, my God, the excuse he had in Iran was way better. And he's had excuses like that many times before. Consider the 12-day war. 12-day war, Israel is pummeling Iran. Iran has no defenses. Israel is operating freely over Iranian airspace. There's nothing they can do. They couldn't shoot down a single Israeli fighter jet. Israel is hours away from producing the collapse of the Ayatollah regime. And what does Trump do? He could have just kept his mouth shut. If he was an enemy of the Ayatollahs, he could just keep his mouth shut. Let Israel do the job. He didn't have to do anything. But he did something, didn't he? He entered the war, dropped 3 bombs, pretended that those bombs solved everything, and then immediately imposed a ceasefire. This is very clear. If Tim is beating the hell out of Tom, and I go in and separate them, I'm protecting Tom. I'm not protecting Tim. This is obvious. And that's what Trump did. The Ayatollahs were about to lose the fight. They were about to lose everything. They were hours away from losing everything. And Trump rushed in to save them. Not only that, after he dropped his bombs and imposed the ceasefire, he wrote in all caps on Truth Social that if Iran so much as dared to throw back one missile at the U.S., he would destroy the Ayatollahs. He made that threat. And then when the Ayatollahs did throw back a few missiles, because the internal grammar of jihadi Iran requires it, instead of making good on his threat, Trump did the same thing he just did. He did nothing. He didn't retaliate against Iran, because if he had, then Israel could have done it too. And the Ayatollahs would have been destroyed. The only way to protect the Ayatollahs was for him to absorb the fact that Iran retaliated and do nothing, because that was the only way to stop the Israelis. And that's what he did.
Why is it that you take Iran's jihadi tendencies on face value, but you wouldn't do that to the U.S. as the protector of the free world, right? I know it's a naive way to put it, but I still want to.
These questions are always answered the same way. What reveals preferences and intentions is the behaviors that people engage in that are very costly. Those are the ones that reveal their true preferences. So the Ayatollahs, so to the question, have the Ayatollahs paid for their attempts to destroy Israel? The answer is yes. They have spent billions of dollars strengthening proxy forces around Israel, and billions of dollars trying to develop nuclear weapons. And they have spent so much money on that, they have already ruined Iran. Iran has no water, because all of the hydrologic infrastructure of Iran was destroyed by the effort of the Ayatollahs to destroy Israel. So clearly they have paid good money for their ideology. So I believe it. They want to destroy Israel. If they had just said we want to destroy Israel, and instead of that they had traded with Israel and shared secrets with Israel, etc., then I wouldn't believe it.
Then you don't believe it when Egypt says it, for example.
Of course not. Egypt is poised to destroy Israel. The behaviors of Egypt are very clear. They have already declared war on Israel implicitly, because Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel signed in 1979 that stipulates that the Sinai Desert has to be free of armament. Therefore, the fact that they have now stationed all kinds of weapons in the Sinai Desert is a violation of the peace treaty. Hence, it is a declaration of war. Israel should have already invaded the Sinai. And Egypt is performing all kinds of military exercises that are obviously a preparation for an invasion of Israel. So, of course, I don't believe Egypt when they say they have peace with Israel. Neither do I believe any of the other Muslim states surrounding Israel when they say they either want or have peace with Israel.
Okay, so I think I know what your answer to this is going to be, but I'm going to try asking anyway. You said that you can tell intentions when things are expensive. So how do you explain the U.S. aid to Israel? Right, Israel is I think the number one, or now it is the number one recipient of foreign aid by the United States. So how do you explain that?
Okay, so there you have to do the algebraic sum. You can't consider Israel by itself, because that makes no logical sense. It makes no logical or strategic sense. Once again, because the people running the U.S. are not idiots. They're very smart. So of course, the people running the U.S. understand that if they give to the enemies of Israel as a composite, right? As a category, more firepower than they give Israel, then obviously they are trying to destroy Israel. It doesn't matter that Israel is the single country that receives the most aid. But even that is not true. So the aid maybe, but aid is not really what matters strategically. What matters strategically is not whether the guns were free or whether you paid for them. What matters strategically is who has the most guns. Whether they got them for free or they bought them is immaterial. So if the U.S. was really protecting an Israeli advantage, Saudi Arabia would not be the country that has gotten the most U.S. weapons of any country on the planet. And this has been true for many decades. And the US government keeps giving Saudi Arabia more and more weapons, okay? And the US would not continue giving weapons to Egypt when Egypt is obviously violating the peace treaty, but that's what they're doing. But I could go on and on, because it's not just the distribution of weapons, which is asymmetric in Israel's disfavor, once you take into account all of Israel's enemies together. it's also the projection of U.S. diplomatic power. So the U.S. stopped Israel in Lebanon when Israel was liberating Lebanon, therefore protected Hezbollah. The U.S. stopped Israel in Syria when Israel was liberating Syria, therefore protecting ISIS, which now governs Syria, which has been officially recognized. Al-Jolani has been officially recognized by Trump as the legitimate government of Syria, and he is even lifting sanctions on Syria now that ISIS runs Syria. He is arming Saudi Arabia. He stopped Israel in Iran when Israel was about to liberate Iran. He threw a huge tantrum when Israel tried to kill a few Hamas leaders that were under the protection of Qatar, and forced Netanyahu to apologize to the emir of Qatar, who is the author of the October 7th massacre, because he's the sugar daddy of Hamas. Right? And he stopped Israel in Gaza when Israel was about to give Hamas the coup de grace in Gaza City. So I think the summary of Trump's collective costly behaviors is rather clear.
Why has the U.S., according to your hypothesis, failed so far to destroy Israel? I don't think it should be that hard, but it's been many years.
Well, I mean, we can discuss that. That's an interesting topic. If somebody's shooting at you and they fail, let's say you duck in time, or you get behind the door, and they shoot 5 times but they don't get you. You don't say to yourself, well, so far they haven't killed me, so maybe they're not trying to kill me. No, if they're shooting at you, and the only reason that you keep surviving is because of your own behaviors, then the fact that they've failed to kill you is not an argument against their intentions being to kill you. Obviously, they want to kill you. They're shooting at you. So the fact that the U.S. has not yet destroyed Israel is not the demonstration that they don't want to destroy Israel. Their intentions are revealed by the quality of their behaviors and by the cost of their behaviors, not by their success or failure so far. Now, why have they failed so far? Well, because it's not that easy to do things indirectly, right? So if the U.S. wanted to destroy Israel and there were no restraints on the behavior of U.S. Bosses, then they could just drop a nuclear bomb on Israel from a U.S. Fighter jet and be done with it. But they can't do that because that would be offensive to a massive chunk of the U.S. population, even many people who are uncomfortable with Israel because their minds have been polluted by the media. Many of those people would be totally offended by their own U.S. government dropping a nuclear bomb on Israel. So, and that would put the ability of those U.S. bosses to hold on to power at risk. So, whatever U.S. bosses do, they have to be always. They always have to be careful to respect the political grammar in which they are operating. They can't do whatever they want. There are grammatical constraints on their behavior. So they have to do things indirectly, which is what they did in World War II. So in World War II, the eugenicists running the US government spent a fortune overseas in Europe, building the eugenics movement in Europe, and then in particular, building the eugenics movement in Germany and nurturing the transition of that eugenics movement into the fully blossomed German Nazi movement. That was done with American money and leadership. So why did they do that? Because they couldn't directly go into Europe to murder the European Jews. They needed a proxy force to do that for them. And it needed to seem like that proxy force was not ideologically aligned with them. So they managed our reality. They made it seem as though they were enemies of the German Nazis that they themselves had created. And then they pretended to fight the German Nazis. So if you notice the dates, well, I mean, they did fight them. I don't want to say that there was no real exchange of fire. They did fight them, but the invasion, the D-Day invasion through Normandy, they didn't even begin to plan that. The Allies didn't until after the Battle of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk is the battle that finally convinced them, that everybody, that the German Nazis had lost the war, because after Kursk, the Soviets finally changed from a defensive posture to an offensive posture, and they started advancing against the German Nazis. And after Kursk, everybody understood that the Nazis had lost the war. And it was 2 months after Kursk that the Western Allies began to plan the invasion via Normandy. So there's a tremendous amount of theater involved here, and the true orientation of these U.S. leaders is revealed in what they did not only during the war, because they gave almost no help to their supposed Soviet allies to fight the Nazis. Meanwhile, historian Charles Hyham has an entire book called Trading with the Enemy, where he documents that during the war, even after Pearl Harbor, the same monopolists who had created the eugenics movement were sending financing, war material, trucks, all kinds of stuff to the German Nazis. Much of this went through Spain, which was pretending to be neutral. And what they did, and what did they do during the war towards the Jewish people? It's really disgusting. There's a document written by mid-level functionaries of the Treasury Department, written during the war, addressed to Secretary Henry Morgenthau, and the title of it is something like, let me see if I remember it. It's the acquiescence of this government in the murder of Jews, or something like that. The acquiescence of this government in the murder of Jews. And what they document is all of the US policies that were contributing to trap the Jews in Europe, where Hitler would find them. So, for example, they turned back the St. Louis, which was an entire boat full of, I think, more than 1,000 Jews who were escaping Hitler, and most of them already had their visas for the United States. They wouldn't let them in. Had to go back to Europe. Nobody took them in. Most of those people were murdered in the death camps. What's his name? Let me see if Breckinridge Long, Undersecretary of State, famous anti-Semite. He sent a memo to the consulates in Europe, consulates and embassies in Europe, stating, look, when Jews come to get their, apply for visas to the United States, what you'll do is you will postpone. So every time they came, you were supposed to tell them, we're having trouble. We're working on it. It's going to take a little longer. Come back next week. Come back next month. But not tell them right away that it was going to be denied. Well, that strategy is designed to trap Jews in Europe, because they're thinking, oh, I'm about to get my U.S. visa any day now. They just said there's a little delay. I'm going to wait a little longer for it, instead of trying for some other escape route before Hitler gets you, right? And they weren't letting them into the United States. They weren't letting Jewish refugees into the United States. Then they didn't bomb the death camps or the train tracks leading to the death camps. Nothing. So when you put all of this evidence together, plus the fact that it was the eugenicists running the United States and also Great Britain, a picture emerges where the representation of self that the people running the United States were doing as supposed anti-Nazis and allies of the Jews is revealed to be a farce, a necessary farce, a grammatical farce, because internal politics in the United States doesn't allow the people running the United States to do this directly. They need a proxy force. So what they did during the 1930s, this is the period that all historians call appeasement, right? Because they call it appeasement because the people running the Western countries were giving Hitler absolutely everything he wanted. So when he wanted to build submarines, okay, build submarines. He wanted to reoccupy the Rhineland, okay, get it. Absorb Austria, sure. Absorb Czechoslovakia, sure. Absorb everything. And the historians call this appeasement because they say that the people running the Western governments were supposedly too cowardly and too stupid. All right, so too stupid to understand Hitler's alleged geopolitical genius, and also too cowardly to confront them because they were so obsessed with keeping the peace, blah, blah, blah. This is the story we learn in school. But from this other perspective, the way you interpret this is, no. This is not appeasement. These people were eugenicists. They were promoting Hitler, not appeasing him. But they had to seem like they were appeasing him, like they were idiots and cowards, because the alternative is that they're pro-Nazi, and that would create an internal political scandal within their own countries that would endanger their hold on power. Okay, so this is why I call what I do the management of reality, because you need to stop interpreting the world through the representation of self that the people running the world make of themselves. You can't do this because they don't grab the microphone to inform you. They grab the microphone to produce an effect, to manipulate you. So the only way to build a reasonable model is to look at what they do.
Why is it that you think that virtually almost all mainstream historians or geopolitical analysts and stuff like that, why do you think that almost no one sees reality the way that you do?
Well, there are some established platforms for interpreting the world that you cannot violate if you want to be a professor at a Western university. One of them is you can't do conspiracy theory. So if you can't do conspiracy theory because it's an academic taboo, well then of course any notion that people are representing themselves as the opposite of what they really are is not something that you can even put on the table. That's one thing. Another thing is that the standard interpretation of World War II was produced by Winston Churchill. Okay, so when the war ended, have you ever heard this old saying, history is written by the victors?
Yeah.
Well, this is the very embodiment of that aphorism. Winston Churchill won World War II, and then right away he wrote the history of World War II. It's a gigantic work in 6 tomes. It's called The Second World War. And in that work, Winston Churchill's The Second World War became a media blitzkrieg. It won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and it immediately became the standard narrative for people everywhere to interpret what had happened in World War II. And all subsequent historians have built on the platform that Winston Churchill built. And guess what? In the first volume of that 6-volume history, which is called The Gathering Storm, where Churchill is supposedly explaining the causes of the war, the term eugenics does not appear even once. In other words, the movement that created German Nazism, which produced World War II, is not mentioned even once in Winston Churchill's book-length explanation of the causes of World War II. Wow. And this is what Western education has been since. Nobody mentions eugenics. So of course nobody can understand the war. And guess what? Winston Churchill was one of the major propagandists for the eugenics movement.
Why do you care? Like personally, why are you doing this?
Well, I care because I want to live in a Judeo-Christian Western civilization, which is what the Nazis want to destroy. I want to live in a world where basic human rights are respected, where people have democratic participation in the political systems, where there is freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of association. I want women to have equal rights to men. I want children to be protected from abuse. I want to live in the modern Western world that was created after the revolutions of 1848. That's the world I want to live in. And that's the world that these people are trying to destroy. So I care because I live here. I'm a Westerner. My family is made up of Westerners. Everybody I care about, for the most part, is a Westerner. And I like the West. I don't want the West to be destroyed. So I'm defending myself and my family, my country, my countries. That's what I'm defending. So why do I care? Because this is about me. I don't want my world to be destroyed. And I believe that the single most strategic fight in the defense of the West is the fight against anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is always the tool that is used to impose totalitarianism. So right now, the totalitarian enemy that is directly threatening the West is jihadism, right? And the jihadis organize great mass killings of Jews. In the previous generation, it was German Nazism. The German Nazis were the totalitarian enemy of all Westerners, and they were organizing great mass killings of Jews. Before that, it was the Russian Tsar. Before that, it was the Catholic Inquisition. Before that, it was the Greco-Roman imperialists. But in every single period of history, the people who are enslaving everybody, all of the Goyim, all of the non-Jews, are organizing great mass killings of Jews. Why? Because if you are trying to make everybody a slave, obviously your first enemy is the society, the religion, the legal political system that was founded on the story of a slave revolt. And that's the Jews, right? So the Jews are descendants of the liberated slaves. This is what we learn in the book of Exodus. The Israelites were slaves of the Egyptian king. And then a revolutionary leader emerges, Moses, who leads them to freedom. And once they are free, once they have escaped the clutches of the oppressive Pharaoh who had enslaved them, they receive a new law. This is the law of the escaped slaves. And it is designed to make sure that nobody will ever be oppressed again, that everybody will have their rights respected. So naturally, the law of the escaped slaves and the example, the lived example of the escaped slaves, loving one another as oneself, as Leviticus 19:18 commands, right? Well, that's going to be very attractive to slaves everywhere. And therefore, it's tremendously subversive for social systems that are based on slavery. So, of course, the slavers from antiquity to modern times have been organizing mass killings of Jews. They're trying to interrupt the transmission of the Torah so that they can enslave us permanently and keep us there.
What is it that you're trying to achieve? Like in reality, like I know that you travel to Israel quite a lot. What is it that you're trying to achieve in Israel?
Oh, well, right now I'm going to Israel to learn Hebrew. But what I would like to achieve, I mean, I can't achieve this, but the grain of salt, or the little grain of salt that I contribute is scientific work to describe the world as it is, not as the media and the universities portray it. Because we cannot defend the West if we don't understand what reality is. You have to know who your enemy is and what your enemy is doing in order to mount a proper defense of the West. If you don't know any of these things, you've already lost, no matter how hard you work. So my contribution to everybody who is trying to defend the West, and there are many of us trying to defend the West, many people doing very, very brave stuff in the streets of the West, but we all need a path to the future. What are we going to build? And exactly how are we going to defend the West? These questions can only be answered if we have a proper description of reality. If we are always operating within a false reality created by our enemies, we've already lost.
So, in your worldview, in a sense, you as an American, you're already governed by your enemies.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that the people who run the governments of the West are our enemies. That is
Plural
exactly.
governments.
Sure. Well, which Western government is an ally of Israel? Which one? They're all allies of the jihadis that are trying to destroy Israel. They're all allies of Hamas. This has been very, very clear in the past a little over 2 years.
Why
Very,
is
very.
it? Why is it? You think that if you were to ask almost any Western European Muslim, he would say that his government is allied with the Zionists and not with the jihadists.
Right. That's the management of reality. So what they do is that every media personality, every anchor in every news show, every politician, every member of the ruling elite of every European country, of every American country, of every Muslim country, including the people running the state of Israel, they will all say to you that the U.S. is an ally of Israel. And they will continue reinforcing this in every single context, no matter what happens, no matter what the evidence is, they will repeat this mantra. That has an effect. But people say to themselves, well, I mean, they can't all be saying something false. It feels totally implausible to the ordinary mind because they've been told not to do conspiracy theory. The only way you could explain that and support the idea that what you're hearing everywhere is false is with a conspiracy theory. But your university training already told you that the minute you propose a conspiracy theory, you're demonstrating that you're paranoid and you need pills or a soft room and a straitjacket, or that you're an idiot or a redneck, one of those. If you're proposing a conspiracy theory, you're one of those, according to the university education we all got. So since the only way to put on the table the hypothesis that what everybody is hearing everywhere concerning the structure of geopolitics is a lie is with a conspiracy theory, well, then your only fallback position is to accept what everybody's saying, even when the evidence contradicts it. So people are watching in real time Donald Trump betraying the Israelis over and over and over again, left and right. I mean, didn't he just announce NATO level protection for Qatar? Qatar is the center of international jihadism. And Trump announced NATO level protection for Qatar after Israel tried to attack a few Hamas leaders in Qatar. And they're going to be training the Qatari Air Force in a U.S. Air Force base in Idaho. I mean, how can anything be clearer? And yet people say, you know, and not to mention that Qatar is the author of the October 7th attacks, right? And then in the face of this and a lot of other evidence that I've summarized for you, people will still say that the U.S. is an ally of Israel. Why? Because everybody says it. And they're not allowed to think a conspiracy theory. That's why.
Well, that's a lot to take in. Where could people find you if they want to look into your work further?
So if they want to look at our work, which exists in different modalities, we have lots of videos, articles, books, and so forth. They should go to franciscogilwhite.com, and that is sort of the hub that will take them to all the different kinds of content that we produce.
Right. You can just send me whatever links you like, and I'll put them all in the description. Okay. So, Francisco Gil-White, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Thank you, Doran. Thank you for your questions. This was a lot of fun.